Dobry to Tuborowski. Well, Ayn Rand seems to have become the official state philosopher of the U.S. today, the Karl Marx of the right. She may not have liked that designation, and her objectivist followers will raise dogmatic knees in full jerk at the statement, but her philosophy is becoming the fundamental orthodoxy from which all dissent is being branded deviance in the corporate world of the United States and its prostitute satellite regimes in Europe. Which is why I'm holding this first edition of her critique of the New Left in the 60s. As you can see, it's titled The New Left, and under it, The Anti-Industrial Revolution. Have you noticed anything ironic on this cover? The rubbled, abandoned factory. Miss Rand would have us believe in the following 200 pages that this desolation is where the student New Left of the 60s. The if it feels good, do it Kantian nihilists were leading Western civilization. But ironically, it's her disciples who deindustrialized the Western world. Her John Galt's decided to shrug it off for its industrial model, with all its mass participation in unionism and welfare states, and rise into the stratosphere of private reality on clouds of free-floating finance capital. This is the result. This is what the hometown of GOP candidate Paul Ryan, Jamesville, Wisconsin, looks like after the objectivist philosophy of his mentor was put on a material basis. No thanks to Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman, or Mario Savo, or Tom Hayden. This mass-market paperback is a collection of her own articles and essays. The add-on material from the newer editions isn't here, but so much the better. I prefer the original version. In her essay, Apollo and Dionysus, we have a typical bitter old lady diatribe of the period against the ungrateful little monstrosities and parasites of the campus. On page 77, she wrote, "The hippies were taught by their parents, their neighborhoods, their tabloids, and their college professors that faith, instinct, and emotion are superior to reason, and they obeyed. They were taught that material concerns are evil, that the state of the Lord will provide, that the lilies of the field do not toil, and they obeyed. They were taught that love, indiscriminate love, for one's fellow men is the highest virtue, and they obeyed. They were taught that the merging of oneself with a herd, a tribe, or a community is the noblest way for men to live, and they obeyed. There isn't a single basic principle of the establishment which they do not share. There isn't a belief which they have not accepted. When they discovered that this philosophy did not work, because in fact it cannot work, the hippies had neither the wit nor the courage to challenge it. They found instead an outlet for their impotent frustration by accusing their elders of hypocrisy, as if hypocrisy were the only obstacle to the realization of their ideals. Lobotomized in the face of an inexplicable reality, and blah blah so forth." Well, that construct is as far from the reality of those real students as anything else Miss Rand ever penned. There never was one model for the American college student, as she then notes further in the piece. Most did not come from elite backgrounds or go to the Ivy League campuses where they would have been taught that the goodies of life descend by entitlement from inheritance, like young Mitt Romney, or as the young disciples Paul Ryan preaches, they flow from the mystic bounty of the free market, where no one actually produces anything or works together to make society function, but some invisible hand pushes everything along to its cosmic equilibrium. Most of them came from lower middle class working families and went to state universities like Kent State in Ohio before they were shot down by the forces of the state, which Miss Rand's readers were then applauding when this book was on the newsstands. Those students came from a background which valued hard work, that the Lord helps those who help themselves, that love for one's fellow human was the basis of Christian faith. The same kind of blue state values that her disciple Paul Ryan is now having to placate while his mentor dumps intellectual philosophical shit all over their down-home beliefs as thoroughly as any liberal snob professor at Berkeley. So, these little parasites of the 60s were the intestinal produce of the free capitalist West, with its superior moral culture and philosophical values. That is what Ayn Rand and her disciples can't seem to face, that her objectivist nihilism is in itself a symptom of the very disease she attempts to diagnose, and her prescriptions are as socially toxic as anything else she attacks. She writes that a rebellion with bromides and cliches on its banners is neither convincing nor inspiring, yet her own philosophy is based upon traditional values of property right, every bit as cliched in the hands of her pseudo-rebel disciples. Elsewhere, she tries making amends. On page 185, in her essay, The Comprachos, she writes, "There is, however, an innocent group of parents, the hard-working, uneducated ones who want to give their children a better chance in life and a brighter future than their own. These parents spent a lifetime in poverty, struggling, skimping, saving, working overtime to send their children through school, particularly through college. They have a profound respect for the educated people, for teachers, for learning. They will not be able to conceive of the compratio mentality, to imagine an educator who works not to enlighten, but to cripple their children. Such parents are the victims of as vicious a fraud as any recorded in history. Yeah. Well, it seems that the vicious fraud being perpetrated on such families now is the nostrum of privatized education. That a voucher handed out to a fly-by-night for-profit outfit won't just put the money in its pocket and leave Johnny more illiterate than ever. What's also ironic is that the students of the Prague Spring of 1968, very much in the news when this came out, which she lionizes here, were inspired by the same intellectual source that she despises. But when they revolted against the orthodox Stalinism of Czechoslovakia, they weren't monstrosities or parasites, but now heroes. In fact, the mass demonstrations that challenged the communist establishment of the late 80s were built on the same philosophical premises as the Western mass movements of the 1960s that she sneered at. It was only after the fact that the Randians moved in and colonized East European universities with philosophical vouchers paid by flat tax revenue. In the Industrial Revolution, an essay further along here, she advocates technology as the real savior of the human race. Well, aside from the fact that technology is apparently made to be abused, the argument has some merits. We couldn't be using this medium otherwise. But yet there's something rather pathetic in this prescription. Many of the high-tech innovators of the late 20th century were firm Randians who gave us a world connected by laptop and cell phone and iPad and Kindle, bypassing the need for physical community, yet transforming us all into software geeks cut out from the physical world and each other, into Mark Zuckerbergs who can't blink their eyes or interact with other humans as they revel in capital gains, surely is not the real end of human evolution. It's also revealing, but typical, that I've yet to find and hear only the slightest passing mention of the specific issues that were promoting campus unrest. The 1965 Berkeley free speech movement was organized by Mario Savio and Tom Hayden, veterans of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and of the Freedom Summer of 1964. That was when 3 of their comrades were assassinated in Neshoba County, Mississippi, by the freely associated death squad of the local state tyrant in the sheriff's badge. So these free speechers had first-hand knowledge of a hard reality that Ms. Rand had spent her entire life avoiding, rather than coming to grips with. Her theory of force would make the Mississippi Freedom Summer activists the aggressors and the local white knights only exercising rifle self-defense and repulsing them. Midnight executions and secret burial in a landfill being mere details. It was just this experience that turned Mario Savio into a hardened radical, a small world after all, who would so bedevil Miss Rand at Berkeley. She held Berkeley's free speech movement as philosophical nonsense because property owners, that is taxpayers, had the ultimate right to determine speech on site, not the speaker. So if the majority of taxpayers who own the streets of Berkeley decide they don't wish to hear Spanish spoken on them, that too would be their proprietary prerogative. In holding property right to be the basis of all others, she seemed to forget that the West's ethical values originated in Greek and Hebrew societies, where individual property, distinct from tribe, family, or community, barely existed. Iceland was then playing little parts in overall Western heritage. Also, there was a little something going on called the Vietnam War, whose escalation coincided with the mass draft of college-age men at which these same students were protesting. Apparently, their choice not to sacrifice their lives for the imperial ambitions of the American corporate state lay in their exposure to progressive education, not in their desire as free individuals to decide for themselves for what cause, if any, they would sacrifice their lives or take the lives of illiterate Asian villagers who had done nothing to them. Many pages are expended here on the imposition of force by college radicals on their fellow students and the college administration. Little is, of course, said about the imposition of clubs on the heads of voting rights workers, or the imposition of napalm on the skins of little girls in Vietnamese villages in Miss Rand's name. I suppose Miss Rand felt an instinctive aversion to this period, precisely because it reminded her of her Russian homeland in 1917. Here and there she alludes to this herself, comparing the hapless regime of President Lyndon Johnson to the luckless provisional premier of Russia, Alexander Kerensky. Like her old homeland in those former days, America was embroiled in an imperial war, and getting the worst of it, plagued by illiterate masses awakening to a sense of their natural and civil rights, seized by unrest exploited by radicals repeating London's slogan of turning the imperialist war into a civil war. Flaming ghettos matched the burning landed estates of nobility, Kent State massacres compared to shooting protesting soldiers, sailors, and workers in the streets of Petrograd in July of 1917. She'd seen it all before, and apparently feared an unraveling society was out to get her a second time at the other end of the planet and of her career. But American society held together, rather than dissolving into chaos and civil war like her old country, no thanks to her objectivist philosophy, but to the altruism that had overtaken developed capitalist society and held it together, giving those on the other end of the clubs and bullets some residual hope in the system they were opposing. The objectivists are knocking at the phone already. Hello? Paul Ryan. You resent this artist's rendition of your hometown? That when you become VP and your plan becomes a state law of the land, this scene will be eliminated? Because there won't be any such eyesore buildings left, and no one will ever remember what they were for.